The moment the evidence clerk turned over the small cardboard box, her thumb smudging a 7-year-old layer of dust, she saw the return address label, and her blood ran cold. The name written there in faded blue ink was not a stranger's name. It was a name that had been spoken from pulpits and printed on missing person flyers. It was the name of the man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Mira Glennon's parents at candlelight vigils, who had bowed his head and offered prayers for her safe return. In that silent, climate-controlled room deep inside the Austin Police Department, the truth began to claw its way out of a package that was never supposed to be found. Before we dive deep into the story, please consider subscribing to Calis-Crime Vault if you've not. It's much appreciated, and keep similar solved cold case stories coming your way. The story begins in Austin, Texas, in the spring of 1992, when the live oaks were thick with pollen and the air carried the first heavy warmth of the coming summer. Mira Glennon was 19 years old, a young woman with a quiet smile and a habit of tucking her auburn hair behind her ears when she was concentrating. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment on South First Street, just a few blocks from shops and a carious that gave the neighborhood its hum of constant, friendly activity. Mira worked part-time at a used bookstore on Congress Avenue and took night classes at Austin Community College, slowly working her way toward a degree in library science. She was not the sort of girl who craved the spotlight. She preferred the company of a few close friends, the weight of a good book in her hands, and the familiar rhythm of her daily routines. Her mother, Ellen, lived in Temple, just an hour north, and they spoke on the phone every Sunday evening without fail. Her father had passed away when she was 12, and her grandmother, Rose, had stepped in to fill that void with fierce, tender devotion. On the morning of Tuesday, April 14th, Mira woke up with a flutter of anticipation in her chest. Her grandmother had called 2 days earlier to say that a birthday package was on its way, a box containing a hand-knitted sweater and a card with a long, newsy letter tucked inside. Myra's 20th birthday was still a week away, but Rose had never been good at waiting. She wanted her granddaughter to have the gift early. Mira had laughed and promised to call the second it arrived. That Tuesday, she had no classes and her shift at the bookstore did not start until 4 in the afternoon. She decided to spend the morning at home, waiting for the mail carrier. Her roommate, Jennifer, left for her job at a downtown coffee shop around 8:30. She later told detectives that Mira was perched on the sofa in her pajamas, a cup of tea cooling on the windowsill, a textbook open on her lap. The two of them chatted briefly about the package. Mira was excited. She loved her grandmother's hand-knitted sweaters. They always smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs, a scent that meant safety. Jennifer waved goodbye and walked out into the hazy morning light. She would never see Mira Glennon again. By noon, the package had not arrived. Mira called the post office and was told that the carrier for her route was running behind schedule. She was told to expect delivery by 2 o'clock. She left a message on her grandmother's answering machine, just a quick check-in, nothing out of the ordinary. Neighbors would later recall seeing her step outside around 1:15, wearing jeans and a light cotton blouse, her hair pulled back with a clip. She walked to the cluster of mailboxes at the corner of South First and Annie Street, peered inside her box, and found it empty. A witness, an elderly man walking his small terrier, saw her standing there with her hands on her hips, looking north up the street as if willing the mail truck to appear. She turned and walked back toward her apartment. That was the last confirmed sighting of Mira Glennon. When Jennifer returned home shortly after 5, the apartment door was unlocked. The television was off. Myra's textbook lay open on the sofa, a pencil marking her place. Her purse, her keys, and her wallet were all on the kitchen counter. Nothing appeared disturbed. But Mira was gone. The package had never come. A missing person report was filed that night. At first, the assumption was that Mira had simply stepped out for a walk and lost track of time, perhaps run into a friend and gone for coffee. But as the hours stretched into a day and then another, the thin veil of hope began to fray. The small, tight-knit community of South Austin rallied quickly. Flyers bearing Mira's photograph, a senior portrait with her shy smile and bright eyes, appeared on telephone poles and in shop windows from Zilker Park to the shores of Lady Bird Lake. Search parties combed the greenbelt. Volunteers waded through the shallows of Barton Creek, and police helicopters swept the sky. An eerie silence fell over the neighborhood. Young women began walking home in pairs. Parents held their children a little tighter. Detectives with the Austin Police Department launched a full investigation. They interviewed everyone who knew Mira. Her circle was small. She had an ex-boyfriend, a student at the University of Texas named David. But the breakup had been amicable, and he had a solid alibi, having been in class all day with dozens of witnesses. She had a co-worker at the bookstore who had sometimes made her uncomfortable with lingering glances, but he too checked out. The mail carrier on her route was questioned. He was a veteran postal employee named Leonard Stokes, a man in his 50s with a clean record and a reputation for reliability. He told investigators he had never delivered a package to Mira's address that day because no such package was on his truck. The Postal Service launched an internal trace and determined that a package addressed to Mira Glennon, sent from her grandmother in Temple, had indeed entered the Austin sorting facility on April 13th. It was scanned and placed on a carrier truck for delivery on the morning of the 14th. But after that, the package simply vanished from the system. It was never scanned as delivered, never returned to the sender, never logged as lost. It was as if it had dissolved into thin air, just like Mira herself. Investigators were left baffled. The missing package became a strange, haunting footnote in the case file. Some theorized that Mira might have intercepted the carrier before he reached her mailbox, taken the package, and then been abducted while carrying it. But no one had seen her with the box. The mail carrier insisted he had not seen her that day at all. Others wondered if the package had been stolen from a truck during a brief stop, a random theft that spiraled into something far more sinister. The case grew cold. Months passed. The flyers faded in the relentless Texas sun. The search parties disbanded. Mira Glennon's mother and grandmother retreated into a grief that time would never fully heal. Years drifted by. The investigation stalled, picked up momentum briefly with a new detective, then stalled again. By 1999, the case file occupied a dusty corner of the cold case unit, a box of yellowing documents and fading photographs that no one expected to ever yield an answer. But answers sometimes hide in places so obvious that they become invisible. In the summer of 1999, a routine audit was ordered for the Austin Police Department's property and evidence room. The facility, located in a nondescript building off East 8th Street, housed thousands of boxes containing everything from seized weapons to forgotten personal effects. A civilian property clerk named Dolores Huerta was assigned the task of cataloging items from older cases, ensuring that evidence was properly stored and that abandoned property could be legally disposed of. Dolores had been on the job for 14 years. She had a methodical temperament and an eye for detail that made her invaluable. On the morning of July 9th, she pulled a medium-sized cardboard box from a high shelf in the back corner of the warehouse. The label on the outside was faded and smudged, but she could make out a case number that dated back to April of 1992. The box had been logged as property seized from a burglary suspect's vehicle, an old van belonging to a handyman named Dale Hensley. Hensley had been arrested for breaking into a house on Jesse Street, just a few blocks from Mira Glennon's apartment, on April 15, 1992, one day after she vanished. At the time, the burglary was treated as a routine property crime. Hensley had a long rap sheet for petty theft and drug possession. The arresting officers had tossed a number of items from his van into evidence bags, including tools, a crowbar, a tangle of copper wire, and a sealed cardboard mailing box that looked entirely unremarkable. That sealed box had been transferred to the property room and forgotten. Dolores slit the evidence tape and opened the box. Inside, beneath a jumble of old rags and a rusty hammer, her fingers found the cardboard mailing box. It was about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wide packing tape. The paper had yellowed with age. She turned it over in her hands. There was a shipping label affixed to the front. The recipient's address, written in delicate looping cursive, was Mira Glennon's apartment on South First Street. The return address, in the same handwriting, was 412 Bluebonnet Lane, Austin, Texas. The name on the return line stopped Dolores cold. It was Warren Lasky. She set the box down and stepped back from the table. Every police officer in Austin knew the name Warren Lasky. He was not a suspect, not a criminal. He was a deacon at the Grace Hill Baptist Church, a man who had served as a volunteer chaplain for the police department, a familiar face at community fundraisers and prayer breakfasts. Warren Lasky had been one of the most vocal and visible volunteers in the search for Mira Glennon. He had handed out flyers, organized prayer circles, and stood on the steps of church with Myra's weeping mother, offering words of comfort in his deep, resonant voice. He was a pillar, a man beyond reproach, and his name and address was written in ink on a package that should have been in Myra's hands 7 years earlier. The discovery sent a seismic shock through the department. The cold case unit was notified within the hour. Detective Sergeant Frank Marchetti, a veteran investigator who had cut his teeth on some of the city's most troubling homicides, was assigned to take a fresh look at the Glennon file. He was a pragmatic man, a realist who had seen too much to be easily surprised. But even he felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck when he held the package in his gloved hands. The evidence room was perfectly quiet. He could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic. He carefully cut the tape and opened the box. Inside was a hand-knitted sweater, soft and blue, with a pattern of white flowers. A birthday card with a drawing of a kitten on the front. A long letter, written in the unsteady hand of an elderly woman, filled with love and news from home. Rose Glennon's gift to her granddaughter. The package Mira had waited for on that April afternoon. It had never been lost in the mail. It had been stolen, intercepted, and hidden away in the cluttered van of a petty burglar who had no idea what he possessed. And the return address on the shipping label, a detail that had seemed so insignificant when the box was first seized, was not Rose Glennon's address in Temple. It was Warren Lasky's home on Bluebonnet Lane. Detective Marchetti drove to Temple that same evening to show Rose Glennon the sweater. The old woman, now in her 80s and frail, wept as she held the fabric to her cheek. She confirmed that she had sent the package, but she was bewildered by the return address. She had never heard of Warren Lasky. She had certainly never put his name or his address on any package she mailed. Someone had carefully removed her original shipping label and replaced it with a new one, a label that bore Lasky's information as the sender. The implication was staggering. The package had been prepared as bait. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of a carefully constructed facade. As detectives dug into Warren Lasky's background, the calm, gentle reminder comes naturally here. a quiet pause amid the gathering storm. And as the truth began to crack open like that weathered cardboard box, we invite you to become part of this journey by subscribing to this channel, so you will be here when the final shocking chapters of these buried stories are brought into the light. Detectives discovered that Warren Lasky was not who he appeared to be. Beneath the polished exterior of the church deacon and community volunteer was a man with a hidden obsession. Lasky had been a postal supervisor at the Austin sorting facility in 1992, a position that gave him access to every piece of mail that passed through the city. He had been working the floor on the night of April 13th when Rose Glennon's package was processed. Surveillance records had long since been destroyed, but employee logs showed he was on duty that evening and had signed out a mail truck for a routine inspection run the following morning, the very truck that had been assigned to Mira's route. Leonard Stokes, the regular carrier, remembered that Lasky had told him to take an extended lunch that day, saying he would cover the route himself for a few hours. Stokes had thought nothing of it at the time. Lasky was his boss. The pieces began to lock into place with sickening clarity. Lasky had pulled the package from the sorting line, opened it, and replaced the shipping label with one that listed his own home as the return address. He had then placed the package on the truck and driven to Mira's neighborhood, but he had not delivered it. Instead, he had watched her. Investigators found a journal hidden in the crawl space of Lasky's home, a journal filled with pages of rambling, obsessive prose about a young woman with auburn hair who worked at a bookstore. He had never mentioned Mira by name, but the descriptions were unmistakable. He had followed her for weeks. He knew her schedule, her habits, her favorite coffee shop. He had become fixated, convinced that they shared a spiritual connection that she had not yet recognized. On the afternoon of April 14, 1992, Lasky had approached Mira near her apartment. Neighbors who were re-interviewed years later recalled seeing a postal truck idling on the corner that day, but no one had thought to mention it during the initial investigation. A woman named Sylvia Reyes, who lived 3 doors down, remembered seeing a young woman matching Mira's description speaking with a uniformed postal worker near the mailboxes. The man had a box in his hands. Sylvia had assumed it was a routine delivery and had gone back inside. That fragment of memory, recalled 7 years after the fact, became a critical piece of the puzzle. Detectives theorized that Lasky told Mira her package had been misrouted and that he would take her to retrieve it. Trusting the uniform, trusting the friendly face she had probably seen around the neighborhood, Mira got into his vehicle. They drove to 412 Bluebonnet Lane. What happened inside that house will likely never be fully known, but forensic investigators who later processed the property found traces of her DNA in the basement, on a concrete floor that had been scrubbed and painted over. A search of the backyard, conducted with ground-penetrating radar, revealed disturbed soil beneath a rose garden. On a warm August morning in 1999, a team of forensic anthropologists carefully unearthed the remains of Mira Glennon, buried in a shallow grave beneath a tangle of roots and thorns. The arrest of Warren Lasky sent a shockwave through Austin that was felt far beyond the city limits. He was taken into custody on a Sunday morning, moments after he had finished leading a prayer service at Grace Hill Baptist Church. Parishioners watched in stunned silence as uniformed officers escorted the deacon out the side door in handcuffs. The small, tight-knit congregation that had loved and trusted him was left reeling. His wife of 32 years, a soft-spoken woman named Clara, collapsed in the front pew. The community that had rallied around the Glennon family now had to confront an almost incomprehensible betrayal. The man who had prayed for Mira's safe return had been the architect of her disappearance. The courtroom drama that followed was intense and emotionally charged. The trial took place in the Travis County Courthouse in the spring of 2001. The prosecution, led by a sharp, methodical district attorney, laid out a case built on circumstantial evidence that was nonetheless overwhelming. The stolen package with the forged return address was a centerpiece, displayed on an evidence table in a clear plastic bag. Rose Glennon, stooped but resolute, took the stand and identified the sweater and the birthday card. Her voice trembled as she described the day she mailed the package, the hope she had felt, and the decades of sorrow that followed. Jurors wept openly. The defense argued that Dale Hensley, the burglar in whose van the box was found, could have been the real killer. They suggested that Hensley, now deceased from a drug overdose in 1996, might have stolen the package and committed the abduction, and that the return address was either a coincidence or a deliberate frame-up. But the postal records, the journal, the DNA in the basement, and the testimony of Sylvia Reyes, who positively identified Lasky in court as the man she had seen speaking with Mira that day, formed a chain that the defense could not break. The most damning moment came when a former co-worker of Lasky's from the Postal Service testified that Lasky had once confided in him about his ability to reroute mail without detection. He had boasted, the co-worker said, that he could make any package disappear. Lasky himself took the stand in his own defense, a decision his attorneys advised against but could not prevent. He was composed, articulate, and deeply unsettling. He denied everything with a calm, almost beatific smile. He claimed the journal was a fictional writing exercise. He claimed the DNA evidence was contaminated. He claimed Sylvia Reyes was mistaken. But when the prosecutor confronted him with the shipping label, held it up so that the courtroom could see his own handwriting on a label he had sworn he had never seen, a crack appeared in his facade. His jaw tightened. His hands, resting on the wooden rail, began to tremble. He had no explanation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Warren Lasky guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gallery erupted in a mixture of sobs and muffled cries. Ellen Glennon, Myra's mother, rose from her seat and clutched Rose's hand. Justice, after 9 agonizing years, had finally been served. In the quiet weeks that followed the verdict, the truths and lies of the case continued to ripple outward. Rumors that had circulated for years were finally put to rest. The suspicion that had unfairly shadowed Myra's ex-boyfriend and her awkward co-worker was lifted. The community began the long process of healing. A memorial garden was planted on the grounds of the Grace Hill Baptist Church, a place where Myra's name could be spoken with love instead of anguish. The unopened delivery, that small cardboard box that had held a sweater and a birthday card, was returned to Rose Glennon. She kept it on her dresser until the day she died, reminder of both profound loss and the relentless persistence of truth. The case of the delivery that never arrived was closed. But even as the gavel fell and the cell door clanged shut, a question lingered in the still Texas air like the last note of a hymn. In the winter of 1990, a young woman named Darla Pritchett had vanished from a laundromat in Round Rock, just 15 miles north of Austin. She had been 22 years old, a student at the community college, a quiet girl who worked at a bakery and sent letters to her sister in Waco every week. She had told a co-worker she was expecting a package from home, a box of her favorite pecan cookies that her mother had promised to mail. That package was never delivered. Darla Pritchett was never seen again. And in the drawer of Warren Lasky's desk, tucked beneath a stack of prayer cards, detectives found a folded piece of paper with a handwritten address on Bluebonnet Lane. Not his own home this time, but an address 4 houses down, a vacant house that had been empty since the summer of 1990. The paper was old, its edges soft from handling. The ink matched the pen from his journal. The implications were clear, but the evidence was thin, a wisp of a thread that might never be strong enough to pull a new case into the light. Warren Lasky has never spoken a word about Darla Pritchett. Not one word. And somewhere out there, a mother still waits by the mailbox, hoping for a package that will never come. The sound of the floorboard splintering under the crowbar was the only warning the search team had before the smell hit them. A thick, sweet, cloying odor that spoke of secrets buried far too long in the Texas clay. The beam of a flashlight swept across the crawl space beneath the vacant house on Bluebonnet Lane and caught the edge of a faded floral blouse. Then another, then a tangle of brown leather sandals. And the men in the dark suits knew in that instant that they had not found one missing girl. They had found a graveyard. The investigation into Darla Pritchett's disappearance had been cold for over a decade. She was 22 years old in January of 1990, a quiet, diligent young woman who lived in a small apartment in Round Rock and worked the early morning shift at a bakery on May Street. She had a sister in Waco, a mother in Killeen, and a habit of writing long, looping letters on pale pink stationery. Her co-workers remembered her as the girl who always brought day-old pastries to share and who spoke of her family with a tenderness that made the older women at the shop smile. On the day she vanished, she had told the bakery owner, a stout, kind-hearted woman named Irma, that she was expecting a package from her mother. A box of pecan cookies, her favorite, baked fresh and mailed priority. Darla was excited. She had checked the mailroom of her apartment complex twice that morning. Witnesses saw her walking toward the communal laundry facility around 11 o'clock, an empty basket balanced on her hip. She never made it inside. The basket was found on the sidewalk, a few scattered clothes still in it, as if she had simply set it down and walked away. But Darla Pritchett was never seen again. The Round Rock Police Department worked the case tirelessly in those first months. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, the mail carrier, the young man she had briefly dated the previous fall. They found nothing. No signs of a struggle. No ransom demands, no body. The package of pecan cookies mailed by her mother from Killeen on January 8th was never delivered. A trace with the Postal Service showed it had arrived at the Round Rock sorting facility on the 9th and was placed on a truck for delivery on the 10th, the day Darla vanished. The carrier that day was a substitute, a man who had filled in on the route only once and whose name was never properly recorded. The regular carrier had called in sick. The package, like Darla, had simply ceased to exist. Over the years, a few detectives had noted the unsettling similarity to the Mira Glennon case. Both young women expecting a package. Both packages vanishing along with them. But the connection had never been firmly established, until the day the note was found in Warren Lasky's desk. Detective Frank Marchetti had been the one to pull the folded piece of paper from beneath the stack of prayer cards. It was ordinary notebook paper, yellowed with age, the edges soft as cloth. The handwriting was Lasky's, the same cramped, angular script that filled the obsessive journal. Written on it was a single address for 08 Bluebonnet Lane, Austin, Texas. For doors down from the Deacon's own home. Beneath the address, a date was scrawled in faint pencil. January 10th, 1990, the day Darla Pritchett disappeared. Marchetti and his team approached the property with a sense of grim inevitability. The house at 408 Bluebonnet Lane had been vacant for nearly a decade. A modest wood-frame bungalow that had belonged to an elderly woman who passed away in the summer of 1989. Her heirs, distant relatives in Oregon, had never sold the place. It sat behind a tangle of overgrown hedges, its windows dark, its porch sagging. To the neighbors, it was just the empty house on the corner, a place where stray cats slept and teenagers dared each other to peek through the dusty windows. No one had any reason to suspect it held the final, horrifying answers to multiple open cases. A full forensic search of the property began on a gray October morning in 1999, weeks after Lasky's arrest for the murder of Mira Glennon. The first day yielded little beyond cobwebs and the skeletal remains of a long-dead raccoon. But on the second day, a cadaver dog named Bruno, a black Labrador with a flawless record, alerted near the crawlspace access door in the back of the house. The door was nailed shut. The nails were not old and rusted, as they should have been. They were newer, galvanized, driven deep into the frame with deliberate force. When the search team pried the door open and descended into the dank, earthen space beneath the house, their light swept across a scene that would haunt every man and woman present for the rest of their lives. The crawl space was not empty. It was an organized arrangement of horror. Clothing carefully folded was stacked in neat piles. Shoes were paired and lined up against the foundation wall. And in the center of the space, shallow depressions in the dirt marked burial sites. There were 4 of them, for distinct, roughly rectangular areas where the soil had been disturbed and then packed down again. The first excavation revealed the remains of Darla Pritchett, identified by dental records, and a small silver ring she always wore on her right hand, a gift from her grandmother. The second revealed a young woman who had been reported missing from San Marcos in 1988, a college student named Caroline Holt. The third and fourth held the bodies of 2 women who had been listed as runaways, teenagers from the foster system with no families to push for answers. Their names lost in a bureaucratic fog until forensic genealogy finally gave them back their identities. Lisa Dunham and Yvonne Marrero, both 17 years old. The small, tight-knit community of Austin and its surrounding towns was plunged into a state of collective shock. This was not a single murder. This was the methodical, decades-long campaign of a predator who had hidden in plain sight, a wolf who had worn the vestments of a shepherd. The news spread like wildfire through the quiet streets of Bluebonnet Lane. Neighbors who had waved to Warren Lasky every morning, who had accepted his casseroles and his prayers, now looked at his house with a kind of hollow, disbelieving dread. The Grace Hill Baptist Church, already reeling from the revelation of Mira Glennon's murder, now faced an abyss. The deacon they had trusted was a serial killer. As the investigation expanded, the pattern became chillingly clear. Lasky had used his position with the Postal Service to identify and track his victims. Each of the young women had been expecting a package. Each package had been routed through the Austin sorting facility where Lasky worked or had influence. He would intercept the package, alter the shipping label, and use it as a lure to gain the victim's trust. He presented himself as a helpful postal worker, a friendly authority figure in a crisp uniform, offering to resolve a delivery problem. Who would suspect a man who delivered the mail? The packages became trophies kept hidden away, sometimes in his van, sometimes in the evidence room of the police department he had charmed his way into as a chaplain. The return address he wrote on Mira Glennon's package, his own home, had been a rare mistake, a moment of arrogance or sloppiness that had finally exposed him. The other packages investigators now believed had been destroyed or disposed of long ago. The discovery beneath 408 Bluebonnet Lane was a turning point, and it is here at the deepest part of this dark and winding path that we pause for a moment of reflection. The stories we tell on this channel are born from a commitment to unearthing the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried. If these narratives of justice and remembrance resonate with you, we ask you to take a quiet moment to subscribe, so that you will not miss the next chapter when it unfolds. The light we shine into these shadows grows brighter with every listener who joins us. The search of Lasky's own home at 412 Bluebonnet Lane intensified. Detectives had already found the journal, Now they tore up floorboards, excavated the backyard, and scanned the walls for hidden compartments. What they found in a locked storage shed behind the garage sent a fresh wave of horror through the investigative team. Inside, meticulously organized on wooden shelves, were items that could only be described as souvenirs. A hairbrush with long auburn strands caught in the bristles. A small jewelry box containing a mismatched collection of earrings, none of them pairs. A stack of birthday cards, all unsigned, but each one dated and bearing the name of a different missing woman. A collection of Polaroid photographs, blurred and poorly lit, showing young women in various states of distress. And a map, a tattered Texas highway map, with small red marks dotting the landscape like drops of blood. The marks were not limited to Austin. They stretched from Waco to San Antonio, from the hill country to the piney woods. Investigators began to fear that the 4 bodies in the crawl space were only the beginning. The map suggested a killing ground far larger than anyone had imagined. Lasky had traveled widely for church conferences and postal training seminars. He had been a guest preacher in small towns across the state. The red marks on the map corresponded to locations where young women had gone missing over a span of nearly 20 years. The task force that assembled to untangle the full scope of his crimes included agents from the FBI, the Texas Rangers, and a dozen local police departments. They began the grim work of cross-referencing the map with cold cases, a process that would take years to complete. In the midst of this unfolding nightmare, an eyewitness confession emerged that added a new and deeply unsettling dimension to the case. A man named Curtis Mayhew, who had served time for a string of convenience store robberies in the early 1990s, contacted the police from his prison cell. He claimed that in the spring of 1991, while working as a day laborer, he had been hired by Warren Lasky to dig a trench in the backyard of a property in Baxter County. The property, he said, was a small farmhouse off a dirt road, surrounded by fields of wildflowers. Lasky told him the trench was for a drainage pipe. Mayhew had thought nothing of it at the time. He was paid in cash and dropped off at a bus station. But years later, when he saw Lasky's face on the television news, he felt a chill run through him. The trench he now believed was a grave. He provided directions to the farmhouse. The property had been sold twice since Lasky owned it briefly in the late 1980s, but records confirmed the purchase. When investigators arrived with shovels and ground-penetrating radar, they found 3 more bodies, all young women, all unidentified at first. One of them was later determined to be a 19-year-old waitress from Elgin named Tess Brewer, who had vanished after telling her roommate she was going to the post office to pick up a package that had been delayed. The trial for the additional murders was a logistical and emotional ordeal unlike anything Travis County had ever seen. Warren Lasky, already serving life for the murder of Mira Glennon, was brought back to the courthouse in chains. The families of Darla Pritchett, Caroline Holt, Lisa Dunham, Yvonne Marrero, and Tess Brewer filled the gallery, their faces etched with a grief that had festered for years without closure. The prosecution presented the evidence from the crawl space, the souvenirs from the shed, the map, and the testimony of Curtis Mayhew. But the most electrifying moment of the trial came from a woman named Bonnie Lasky, Warren's niece. Bonnie was a slender woman in her early 30s with deep circles under her eyes and a voice that shook with the effort of speaking the words she had held inside for most of her life. She took the stand and told the court that when she was 16 years old, her Uncle Warren had offered her a ride home from a family gathering. Instead of taking her to her parents' house, he had driven to a secluded spot near the Colorado River and shown her a box in the trunk of his car, a cardboard shipping box with a woman's name on it. He told her in a voice that was calm and almost kind that the woman who was supposed to receive that package was now in a better place. He told her that he had been chosen to help young women find their way to heaven. Bonnie had been too terrified to speak. For years, she had convinced herself it was a dream, a nightmare conjured by an overactive adolescent mind. But when the news of the bodies broke, she knew she could no longer remain silent. Her testimony painted a portrait of a man who had wrapped his homicidal compulsions in a twisted theology, a self-appointed angel of death who believed he was saving his victims from the corruptions of the world. Lasky's defense attorneys attempted to paint Bonnie as a troubled woman seeking attention. They pointed to inconsistencies in her timeline, to the years she had stayed silent. But the jury had seen the photographs of the crawlspace. They had heard the forensic anthropologist describe the way the victims had been carefully laid to rest, their clothing folded, their hands placed over their chests as if in prayer. The ritualistic nature of the burials aligned too perfectly with Bonnie's description of her uncle's delusions. The jury found Lasky guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to additional life terms, an act of legal formality since he would never leave prison alive. But the verdict brought a measure of peace to the families who had waited so long to hear the word guilty spoken aloud. The truths and lies that had swirled around the cases for a decade or more were slowly, painfully untangled. The rumors that the victims had run away, that they had been involved with drugs or dangerous men, were laid to rest. They had been innocent women, living ordinary lives, targeted for no reason other than the proximity of a post office box and the cruel randomness of a monster's attention. The Postal Service implemented sweeping reforms in the wake of the scandal, tightening the protocols for package tracking and employee oversight. The evidence room at the Austin Police Department was audited from top to bottom, and the Glennon, Pritchett, Holt, Dunham, Marrero, and Brewer families began the long, difficult process of stitching their lives back together. A memorial was erected in a quiet corner of Zilker Park, a circle of stone benches surrounding a fountain, with the names of Lasky's known victims carved into the granite. On the day of its dedication, hundreds of people gathered under a pale autumn sky. Ellen Glennon spoke, her voice steady and clear, thanking the detectives and the volunteers who had never given up. Rose Glennon, too frail to attend, watched from a wheelchair in the front row, her hand resting on the folded blue sweater she had knitted for her granddaughter nearly a decade earlier. The wind stirred the surface of the fountain, and for a moment, the silence that fell over the crowd was not eerie but sacred, a shared breath of remembrance and release. With the final resolution of the case, the shocking, chilling ending that stunned the entire community did not come from a courtroom or a memorial service. It came from a dusty evidence box that had been overlooked in the chaos of the sprawling investigation, a box that had sat on a shelf in the property room for an additional 2 years, untouched and unexamined. In the spring of 2002, a new evidence clerk, an intern cataloging cold case materials as part of a university project, opened the box and found a VHS tape. The label on the tape was handwritten in Warren Lasky's unmistakable script. It read simply, "The deliveries," followed by a date, March 3rd, 1991. The tape was rushed to the task force. The lead detective, Frank Marchetti, now grayer and more weathered than he had been when he first opened the package meant for Mira Glennon, sat in a darkened room and watched the screen flicker to life. The footage was shot on a handheld camcorder, the image unsteady but clear enough to make out a dimly lit room that Marchetti recognized as the basement of 412 Bluebonnet Lane. Warren Lasky was not visible behind the camera, but his voice filled the speakers, a low, rhythmic murmur that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the room. He was speaking to a young woman who sat bound to a wooden chair. She was crying, her face streaked with tears, but she was alive. The camera zoomed in on her face. Marchetti's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that face before on a missing person flyer from 1989. A young woman named Kelly Darnell who had disappeared from a bus stop in Georgetown. Her case had never been connected to Lasky. She had not been found in the crawl space. She had not been on the map. On the tape, Lasky's voice, gentle and almost tender, told Kelly that she was special, that she had been chosen, and that her delivery was waiting for her. He then produced a small cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. He placed it in her lap. The camera held steady as she slowly, with trembling fingers, opened the package. Inside was not a gift. It was a handgun. The tape continued for another 47 minutes. What it contained, the details of what transpired in that basement, are not described here out of respect for the victims and their families. It is sufficient to say that the tape revealed the full, unvarnished depth of Warren Lasky's depravity. It also revealed a truth more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. At the very end of the recording, Lasky turned the camera around and faced the lens. He smiled a calm, serene smile and said, "There are 17 deliveries still waiting. They are all addressed. They are all on their way." The screen went black. The room was silent. The number 17 sent a new shockwave through the task force. Lasky had been convicted of 6 murders. The map had suggested at least 9 potential additional victims. But 17? The statement, delivered in that calm, measured voice, was either a delusional boast or a terrifying roadmap. The task force was disbanded years later, but not before it had identified 9 more cold cases with patterns consistent with Lasky's method. The remaining 8 have never been resolved. The packages, if they ever existed, have never been found. Somewhere in the dead letter offices and forgotten storage rooms of the American postal system, there may still be boxes with fake return addresses, waiting for young women who will never come home. The town of Austin and the many small communities touched by this darkness continue to live with the uncertainty. Warren Lasky died in his prison cell in 2015, taking his secrets with him. The deliveries he spoke of remain a mystery, a ghost story whispered by those who remember. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows through the live oaks and the mail trucks rumble down the empty streets, one can almost hear the echo of a knock on a door that was never answered, and the soft, patient voice of a man in uniform asking, "Are you expecting a package?" The years that followed the discovery of the VHS tape inside the dusty evidence box were not marked by dramatic courtroom battles or fresh headlines. They were marked by a quieter, more persistent kind of reckoning, a slow and painful digestion of the truth that Warren Lasky had not merely been a killer, but a collector of souls, a man whose monstrous appetites had reached further than any single investigation could fully map. The number 17, spoken in his own voice on that grainy recording, hung over the city of Austin like a shroud. It seeped into the conversations of neighbors who had once believed they lived in the safest corners of the hill country. It cast a pall over the simple act of checking the mail, of hearing the low hum of a postal truck rounding the corner, of finding a package on the doorstep that one did not remember ordering. The city, the towns, and the extended families caught in the web of this tragedy began a long, collective journey through the shadowlands of grief, memory, and the stubborn, unyielding quest for whatever piece could be salvaged from the wreckage. The Glennon family, who had already endured the loss of Mira and the excruciating trial that followed, now faced a new and unfamiliar trial. The trial of living in a world where the full dimensions of her murderer's crimes had been exposed. Ellen Glennon, Mira's mother, became a quiet but steadfast advocate for the families of the unidentified victims, the ones whose names had not yet been restored. She volunteered at a small nonprofit that worked to match missing person cases with unidentified remains, spending long hours in a cramped office near the University of Texas campus, staring at photographs of young women who had vanished from lonely bus stops and rural highways. She told a reporter once, in a rare moment of public reflection, that she had learned to measure time not in years, but in the faces of the still missing. She had grown older, her hair silvered, her steps slower, but her eyes retained a fierce, unwavering light. She would not let the world forget. Rose Glennon, Mira's grandmother, passed away in 2004 at the age of 87. The blue sweater she had knitted for her granddaughter was buried with her, folded across her heart, a final reunion in the quiet earth of a temple cemetery. The Pritchett family of Killeen, the Holts of San Marcos, the Dunham and Marrero relatives scattered across the foster care systems that had failed them, all carried their grief into the new century with a weight that never fully lifted. Darla Pritchett's mother, a woman named Cecilia, planted a pecan tree in her backyard the year after her daughter's remains were finally laid to rest. She tended it with a devotion that bordered on the sacred, watering it through droughts, wrapping its trunk in burlap when the winter ice storms came. She told her neighbors that the tree was Darla, that the sweet nuts it eventually bore were the cookies her daughter had never received. It was a small act of defiant love, a way of rewriting the ending that Lasky had tried to steal. The extended families formed a loose, informal network of support, bound together by the incomprehensible bond of shared tragedy. They called one another on anniversaries, sent cards on birthdays, and gathered each April at the Memorial Circle in Zilker Park for a candlelight vigil that grew smaller with each passing year, but never entirely disappeared. The city of Austin itself underwent a profound and subtle transformation in the wake of the Lasky revelations. The small, tight-knit community that had once prided itself on its neighborly warmth now carried a current of wariness beneath the surface. Parents who had grown up in the free-range days of the 1970s and 1980s began to hold their children a little closer at the mailbox. The Postal Service, eager to restore public trust, launched a campaign called Safe Delivery, which included tamper-evident packaging, improved tracking systems, and mandatory background checks that reached deeper into an employee's history than ever before. The sorting facility where Lasky had once worked was renovated and renamed, the old brick facade replaced with a modern sterile frontage that bore no resemblance to the place where he had stalked his victims through the mail. But the memory of what had happened there lingered like a stain that no amount of fresh paint could fully conceal. The vacant house at 408 Bluebonnet Lane was eventually demolished. The city council voted to purchase the lot and transform it into a small community garden, a gesture intended to reclaim the land from the darkness that had festered beneath it. For a time, the garden flourished. Sunflowers grew tall and bright. Neighbors planted tomatoes and peppers and fragrant herbs. But the garden never quite shook its haunted reputation. On certain evenings, when the light slanted through the trees in a particular way, visitors reported a sudden chill in the air, a sense of being watched, a whisper of sorrow that seemed to rise from the very soil. The garden was eventually abandoned, left to grow wild. The lot remains empty to this day, a patch of tangled weeds and wildflowers that no one has the heart to develop and no one has the courage to disturb. Children in the neighborhood dare one another to step onto the grass after dark. Few ever do. This long, uneasy aftermath is not simply a story of sorrow. It is a story of resilience, of the stubborn human refusal to be defined by the worst things that have happened. And it is here in the quiet persistence of that resilience that we invite you to become a part of this ongoing journey. The stories we share on this channel are not only about the crimes themselves, they are about the communities that survive them, the families that endure, and the truths that must never be forgotten. If you believe, as we do, that remembrance is a form of justice, We ask you to subscribe so that you will be here when the next chapter of these hidden histories is brought into the light. The task force that had been assembled to identify the remaining victims of Warren Lasky continued its work for 7 more years, a marathon of forensic genealogy, soil analysis, and the painful re-interviewing of witnesses who were now elderly and frail. They identified 9 additional young women whose disappearances matched Lasky's pattern, whose paths had crossed his postal routes, whose names had been scrawled in the margins of his journal or marked on his tattered map. 3 of those women were found in shallow graves on a ranch outside of Fredericksburg, a property that Lasky had visited for church retreats in the early 1980s. Their families, who had waited decades for answers, finally received the grim closure of a funeral. But 8 names on the list of 17 remained stubbornly unresolved. The map led to places where no bodies were ever found, where the soil refused to yield its secrets. Some detectives came to believe that Lasky had been lying, that the number 17 was a final act of sadistic theater designed to torment the living from beyond his prison cell. Others were not so sure. The Texas Rangers kept the files open. The photographs of the missing women remained pinned to a corkboard in a cold case office, their faces fading a little more with each passing year, waiting for a knock on the door that might never come. Warren Lasky himself lived out his remaining years in the Allenby Polunsky Unit, a maximum security prison in West Livingston, Texas. He was housed in solitary confinement for his own protection, a necessary measure given the number of inmates who would have gladly ended his life. He received no visitors except for a single journalist who managed to secure an interview in 2010. The journalist, a young woman from the Austin American-Statesman, described him as calm, articulate, and utterly without remorse. He spoke of his victims with a detached, almost clinical fondness, as if they were characters in a novel he had once read and not human beings whose lives he had extinguished. He claimed in that same soft, measured voice that had echoed through the basement of 412 Bluebonnet Lane that he could not remember how many young women he had helped find their way to heaven. The number, he said, was not important. What mattered was the grace he had bestowed upon them. The interview was published and met with widespread revulsion. Lasky died 5 years later, on a sweltering August morning in 2015, of a heart attack in his cell. He was 67 years old. No one claimed his body. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds, his final resting place known only to the guards who dug the hole. The city of Austin and the surrounding towns have spent the years since his death engaged in the difficult, unglamorous work of healing. The Grace Hill Baptist Church, which had been shattered by the revelation that one of its most beloved leaders was a serial predator, undertook a long process of institutional soul-searching. The congregation dwindled for a time, then slowly rebuilt itself under the leadership of a new pastor who spoke openly and honestly about the danger of placing any human being beyond scrutiny. The church established a fund in Mira Glennon's name, a scholarship for young women pursuing careers in criminal justice, a way of transforming the pain of the past into a promise for the future. Every year, a recipient is chosen from applicants across the state. The award ceremony is held in the church fellowship hall, beneath a large photograph of Mira, her shy smile and bright eyes a permanent reminder of what was lost and what must be protected. The extended families, those who lost daughters and sisters and granddaughters, have navigated the years in ways both unique and universal. Some have found solace in advocacy, lobbying for stronger postal regulations and better coordination between missing person databases. Others have retreated into the private sanctuaries of their homes, tending gardens and grandchildren, allowing the passage of time to soften the sharp edges of their grief. Family reunions now include empty chairs that are never filled, photographs that are passed around with trembling hands, and moments of silence that speak louder than any words. The sister of Caroline Holt, a woman named Margaret who now lives in Houston, told a documentary filmmaker that she still writes letters to her sister every year on her birthday. She mails them to their childhood home in San Marcos, a house that was sold long ago. The letters are always returned, stamped return to sender. She keeps them in a box under her bed. It is, she says, her way of keeping the mail moving, of refusing to let the silence be the final word. The younger generation of these families, the nieces and nephews and cousins who were born after the tragedies or were too young to remember them, have grown up in the shadow of a story that feels both impossibly distant and achingly present. They have heard the whispered warnings from their parents and grandparents, the admonitions to be careful at the mailbox, to never accept a package from a stranger, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. They have visited the memorial circle in Zilker Park, tracing the carved names with their fingers, trying to understand the weight of a history they did not choose, but have inherited nonetheless. For them, the story of Warren Lasky is not merely a true crime tale from a bygone era. It is a cautionary inheritance, a reminder that monsters do not always arrive with fangs and claws. Sometimes they arrive with a kind smile, a pressed uniform, and a package in their hands. There is a piece of hard-won wisdom that has emerged from the long decades of this case, a truth that the families and the investigators and the community leaders have tried in their own ways to pass on to those who are coming of age in a world that is at once more connected and more fragmented than ever before. The advice is simple, but it carries the weight of all the grief and all the courage that this story contains. Trust, the kind of trust that builds communities and binds generations, is a precious and fragile thing. It must be earned and it must be verified. The uniform, the title, the position of authority. These things are not proof of virtue. They are merely costumes, easily worn by those who wish to hide. The young people who are building their lives today, who order packages with a tap of a finger and share their locations with a network of digital friends, must remember that the world is full of unseen corners. The predator does not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes he stands in the light with an outstretched hand and a comforting word, and waits for the moment when your guard is lowered. The story of Mira Glennon and Darla Pritchett and all the others is not a relic of a simpler, safer past. It is a mirror held up to the present, a stark reminder that evil adapts, that it learns the language of the community it seeks to exploit, and that it thrives on the assumption that such things could never happen here. The mail still arrives every day in the neighborhoods of Austin. The carriers wear their blue uniforms and drive their familiar white trucks. The packages come wrapped in brown paper and sealed with tape, bearing the names and addresses of the recipients. Children still run to the mailbox with a thrill of anticipation. Adults still tear open cardboard boxes with a sense of minor ceremony. Life has continued as it must, but beneath the surface of that ordinary ritual, there's a current of memory that has not faded. The story of the delivery that never arrived and the 17 deliveries that followed is woven into the fabric of the city like the roots of the live oaks that grip the limestone soil. It is told in hushed tones at dinner tables. It is studied in criminal justice classrooms. It is remembered in the flicker of candlelight each April, when the names are read aloud and the water in the memorial fountain catches the glow. The town of Austin today is a bustling modern city, a hub of technology and music and culture. Its skyline has changed dramatically since 1992. The modest apartment on South First Street where Mira Glennon once waited for her grandmother's package is gone, replaced by a sleek condominium building with a coffee shop on the ground floor. The used bookstore on Congress Avenue is a distant memory, its space now occupied by a boutique hotel. The sorting facility where Lasky worked is a gleaming distribution center, its employees tracked by digital systems that leave no package unaccounted for. The physical landmarks have shifted, but the emotional geography remains. There are still parents in this city who pause before opening a package they did not expect. There are still young women who double-check the return address before accepting a delivery. There are still detectives now retired who wake in the night with the faces of the missing women imprinted on their memory. The case of Warren Lasky is officially closed. The boxes of evidence are sealed in a climate-controlled warehouse. The files are archived, but the story refuses to end because the lives it touched are still being lived. The families are still gathering for holidays with an ache that time has not erased. The memorial circle still draws visitors who leave flowers and handwritten notes. The scholarship in Mira Glennon's name still sends a young woman to college every year, a small beacon of light kindled from great darkness. The advice that the older generation passes to the younger is not a lecture delivered from a podium. It is a quiet, persistent refrain offered with love and with the authority of hard experience. Pay attention, ask questions, trust your instincts, and remember that the package on your doorstep, the one you have been waiting for, should never come at the cost of your safety. The VHS tape, the one labeled The Deliveries, was sealed by court order and has never been viewed by the public. It remains in the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, a piece of evidence too disturbing for release, a relic of a cruelty that the community has chosen, in its collective wisdom, not to amplify. But the knowledge of its existence, the echo of those 17 promises, continues to haunt the collective imagination. The 8 women whose names were never linked to physical remains are still listed as missing. Their families still wait. The postal trucks still rumble down the quiet streets at dusk. And the most chilling, shocking truth that settled over the community after all the headlines faded and the reporters moved on was not that a monster had lived among them. It was that the monster had been so utterly, devastatingly ordinary. He had been a neighbor, a deacon, a familiar face in the pews. He had handed out flyers for the missing. He had bowed his head in prayer with their parents. He had worn the mask of decency so perfectly that no one thought to look beneath it. The final lasting lesson of the case is a sobering one, and it is offered here not as a piece of sensational drama, but as a gentle, urgent plea to the generations who are coming of age in a world that still contains such hidden dangers. The world is full of packages that arrive without warning, of offers that seem too convenient to question, of strangers who wear the uniform of trust. Walk through that world with your eyes open. Listen to the quiet voice inside you that whispers when something is not right. And never, ever forget that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who have already been invited inside the gate. Before you go, if you find value and appreciate the story, please consider hitting subscribe and like the video, and turn on notifications too, so you don't miss the next interesting dramatized solved cold case video. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.